You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 22nd of April 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, in a sign of increased frustration with Israel, the US plans to cut support to an Israeli battalion believed to have carried out abuses. Benjamin Netanyahu promises to fight any sanctions and also to step up the offensive in Gaza. Also coming up, after 6 months of wrangling, the US approves billions of dollars in military aid for Kyiv. Will it be enough to keep Ukraine in the fight against Russia? Plus,
the Secretary of State Antony Blinken prepares for all-important talks in China. America's airlines demand curbs in the number of direct flights between the two countries. I'm Simon Marks with that story coming up from Washington.
We'll also be joined by a Balkans correspondent for the latest.
Boycott follows boycott in Kosovo, and Croatia's new government could be tacking to the right. I'm Monocle's man in the Balkans, Guy Delaunay, and I'll bring you all the latest from the region.
Plus the papers, and Venice goes to town in its Biennale. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. At least 5 rockets have been launched from Iraq's town of Zumar towards a US military base in northeastern Syria. China's ambassador to Canada has left his post and returned to China. And thousands of supporters of the former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro have held a rally in Rio de Janeiro. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pledged to increase military pressure on Hamas in the coming days. He made the remarks in a televised message to mark the Passover holiday. Meanwhile, in Gaza, Palestinian health officials say an airstrike on a block of flats in Rafah killed 15 members of the same family, including 13 children. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Leila Molana-Allen, who's Monocle's Middle East correspondent. A very good morning to you, Leila.
Morning, Emma.
Now, this promise that Netanyahu delivered yesterday, I mean, Israel hasn't launched its long-awaited assault on Rafah, but this promise that he's going to step up attacks and this airstrike on a block of flats in Rafah shows that the assaults are still coming thick and fast.
They absolutely are. So what we saw a few weeks ago was that all the battalions but one were pulled out of Gaza, all the Israeli battalions. And the reason given at the time wasn't that they were stepping down the war at all. It was simply to sort of refresh. Now, I've spent many months of this war in Israel, and all young men as well as many young women are fighting. So, of course, what that means is businesses aren't working. There's no one to staff anything. 300,000 reservists were called up. So the idea is that they want to give those people a break. They want to kind of have some turnover before the next assault. Now, this assault on Rafah is, as is the whole war, hugely controversial. We've got 1.7 million utterly defenseless people taking shelter in this area right next to the Egyptian border where they're not allowed through. Most of these people have been displaced multiple times. They are living in tents. Many of them have injuries. Many of them are deeply traumatized, having lost family members. They are suffering severe hunger and lack of water. Now, a few 100,000 of those people have moved back up towards Khan Yunis, the biggest city in the south, which is completely destroyed since those battalions pulled out looking for shelter. But of course, if another barrage comes in, they'll move back south. And really, they're sitting ducks. There's nowhere for the civilians there to go. So while the IDF and Netanyahu maintain that they must hit Rafah in order to wipe out Hamas, the international community is desperately trying to convince them not to, because this would be one of the bloodiest assaults we've seen in this very bloody war.
Indeed, the United States has said it won't support a military operation in Rafah because of the risk to the civilians that you just described. I mean, in a moment, we're going to talk about some sanctions which the United States may impose on it. So there is a sense now that the US at least is pushing back.
It is at last. It's been an extremely difficult and precarious position throughout this war for the US, obviously very long-time ally and supporter of Israel. Most of Israel's military defense comes from America. It's also supported by multiple European countries, but really all the money and all the power does come from Washington. And President Biden himself is an avowed Zionist. He's always said that. But increasingly behind the scenes first and now publicly, Biden, Blinken, they're all saying we cannot continue to support this level of civilian death for a war purportedly against Hamas. 34,000 people now have died in Gaza. Now, the IDF and the Israeli government say that they think they've killed about 14,000 Hamas soldiers. Realistically, that would have to mean that every single adult man, as well as some male children that they've killed, were Hamas fighters. So that's a completely unrealistic statistic. But it's very difficult while still in the midst of war to identify how many they actually have killed of these fighters. And also there have been a lot of controversy over stated from the IDF how many civilians they think it's legitimate to kill while killing a Hamas fighter. Sometimes they're saying up to 6 or 7 they've been told it's legitimate to kill while taking out one fighter.
And indeed, there is that continued problem of reporting what is going on, given the fact that no reporter can get into Gaza.
Absolutely. No international reporters are able to get into Gaza. We haven't been able to since the beginning of the war. And part of the problem here is lots of the public still don't know that. Many people sort of feel that because they're not seeing, the well-known international reporters who they're seeing all over Israel and the West Bank inside Gaza, that means that some of the things they're seeing on social media and some Palestinian reporters aren't true or aren't important. We have not been allowed inside except on IDF embeds, and that's a very particular controlled situation where you go in with IDF forces, they control what you can see, what you can speak to. It's very brief, and then you leave. So there's been no free reporting for international journalists. Of course, we have incredibly brave Palestinian journalists who live and work inside Gaza reporting. Over 100 of them now have been injured or killed. Many of their families have been killed. They're doing their very best, but they have no report reinforcement or, frankly, the support of being an international journalist, a well-known journalist who goes in and kind of has that kudos that we're seeing on the other side that people expect their reporting to come from. So it means the narrative is very, very unbalanced.
Let's talk a little bit more about these proposed sanctions which have been mentioned over the weekend. I think there were reports coming out of Washington that the US was or is planning to cut aid to one Israeli unit following human rights violations in the occupied West Bank. I mean, this is something that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that he will fight with all his strength. But these sanctions also come on the very same weekend that the US guarantees more military support for Israel to the tune of tens of billions of dollars.
It does. Now, this is all bound up together. It's deeply complicated. I'll start with this foreign aid bill. Now, this is a general $95 billion foreign aid bill. It includes aid to Ukraine, to Taiwan, and inside it has been a package for military aid for Israel, which gets renewed every year. Now, theoretically, most of that is defensive aid, but of course, within that, there's upgrades to a lot of weaponry that is being used offensively right now. What's been passed, that was passed on Saturday, it's about 17 billion roughly of that is going to Israeli defense. Then there's about $9.2 billion for aid, humanitarian aid, not all of it for Israel and the region. Some of it's going other places, and specifically not all of it for Gaza either. Probably about 2 billion will go to Gaza. But there was this huge debate over whether or not this should be passed. Some Democrats saying we simply cannot continue to support this war as it is currently and give them more money for weaponry. Others saying, but then they won't get the aid. So it's difficult because the aid is humanitarian aid is bound up with the defensive aid. It did eventually pass. But this specific thing against an IDF unit, it's actually more than withholding help from them. Biden wants to specifically have targeted sanctions on this one IDF unit. Now, this is a unit that's called Netzah Yehuda. It was set up, this is actually about their activities before the Gaza war. They've been being investigated for a couple of years under a law from about 30 years ago, an American law that says that the American government cannot support any foreign military unit that's known to commit human rights abuses. This is a unit that was set up inside the occupied West Bank, where there are internationally illegal settlements being built. And increasingly, it's become a unit that settlers and what's called hilltop youth, which are angry, violent young settlers who want to commit atrocities against Palestinians, have tended to gravitate towards. They've been accused of multiple assaults, multiple humanitarian violations against the Palestinians that they monitor there, and were eventually moved away from the West Bank last year because the situation was getting so bad. So the idea is Biden wants to specifically sanction this unit so that no US military funding or training or support can be sent to them. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has responded very angrily, saying any form of sanctions against any part of the Israel Defense Forces is completely unacceptable. He will not accept it. He will fight it because it's the start of a slippery slope. So this is all part of an issue about whether or not America will continue to support Israel, the Israeli army's activities right now.
And it goes back to the original point that we were discussing a few moments ago, which is these questions that are now being raised about how much the United States will actively support Israel.
Absolutely, because of course there are all these issues again are bound up together. Now, the United States, of course, actively supports. It's crazy almost that this question is still being asked 75 years later, but because it's such a controversial country for some people, the United States will always actively support the existence of Israel, the safety of Israeli citizens, but whether they're willing to support any means for the protection of those people, the killing of thousands of other people, specifically Palestinians in this situation, Palestinians who live in occupied territory, whose movements controlled, who've been under assault for many, many years, who have lived under their own sanctions where they haven't been able to get hold of what they need. That's the question, is whether Israel's going to be allowed to continue to do whatever it is they like. And this whole settlers issue in the West Bank is a big part of that. America very clearly has ascribed to the fact that settlements should not be built in this land in the West Bank, but ideally in the future, if there were a peace settlement, would be part of a package of Palestinian land for a Palestinian state. And what we're seeing as the war goes on in Gaza is a huge spike in violence in the West Bank from these violent settlers, driving Palestinians out of their villages, burning their villages, taking that land, leaving them homeless. So there's a land grab going on while the world focuses on the other side, which is Gaza.
What can the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu realistically do, though? I mean, he's, as you say, has described a US action. He's called it the height of absurdity, a moral low point. The National Security Minister in Israel, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has said that this action will actually vow him to push for Israeli sanctions on the Palestinian Authority. So there are domestic actions that they could take. But if Israel feels as if the United States' support is being questioned, what can Israel do? And what effect does this have on Israel's international standing?
Right now, Netanyahu and his allies are playing chicken, essentially. So since the beginning of the war, we've seen, as I said, firstly privately and now increasingly publicly, American officials trying to put pressure on the Israeli government to simply commit fewer human rights abuses, kill fewer people, be more careful in the way that they're conducting this war. And there's just been a repeated refusal. Their response is always, we are the most moral army in the world. We are fighting in the most moral way. So they don't say, oh, yes, we'll try. They just say, no, we're already doing that. We're already doing what we're asking. And then forces go and kill another few thousand people. So it's been this constant back and forth. And Biden has said he's becoming increasingly frustrated. So they're being pushed into a situation where eventually America might have to turn around and say, no, we really are going to stop funding you, or no, we really are going to sanction these certain people. That's what Biden's trying to do at the moment, is pick and choose what he stops supporting rather than being pushed into a situation where they have to freeze any kind of support. Now, there is more that Netanyahu and his allies can do. He is, of course, in this extremely right-wing coalition government. He himself is an avowed supporter of, complete Israeli dominance over these lands. He doesn't want to give up any land for a Palestinian state. But his allies, people like Ben-Gvir, there's also Smotrich, another one of his ministers, who are incredibly hardcore right-wingers who believe in essentially the eradication of Palestinians from these lands. If they start to sanction the Palestinian Authority more than they have been already, if they start to withdraw funds from the Palestinian Authority, which they've done several times in retribution throughout this war already, that creates even more difficult living conditions for Palestinians. They're also carrying out airstrikes in the West Bank, which was previously unheard of. They're raiding camps constantly. They're allowing these violent activities from settlers to go on sometimes with IDF support. So they really can make life so much more difficult for Palestinians than it already is. And if they decide to launch an attack on Rafah without US support, that really becomes a sort of line in the sand where they are actively and publicly ignoring their strongest ally, with a US election coming up, which creates an incredibly difficult situation for President Biden.
Leila Molana-Allen, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. It's 9:15 in Kyiv, nearly 9:15 here in London. Now, after months of stalling, the US House of Representatives has approved tens of billions of dollars of military aid to Ukraine in its fight against Russia. It also, as we heard a moment ago, approved billions in support for Israel in its war against Hamas and Taiwan to help it counter China. But will it help Kyiv push back the Russian invaders? Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, who's a Ukrainian MP and chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Integration of Ukraine into the European Union. A very warm welcome back to Monocle Radio, Ivanna.
Thank you. Good morning.
So how much of a difference will this make? There's been an awful lot of celebratory words from Kyiv over the weekend.
Well, definitely for us, it's a huge relief and hope. We also hope that Senate won't postpone the vote and President Biden will sign it in immediately as he gets the bill. For us, it's a possibility to get so much needed military equipment to the front lines and also additional air defense to protect our cities. I think that that is also going to mobilize additionally our other Western partners, following the example of the US as well. So we do hope that we are getting stronger this way and that we are going to be capable of pushing back on the enemy. Moreover, we also understand that this is not the last time when we would probably need this support. So we should not exhale. We should just continue working together.
Indeed, but it had got to the point where Volodymyr Zelensky was saying that without United States help, Kyiv would lose against Moscow. How true is that statement?
Well, it seemed that it's very close to that because unfortunately all the other countries that are providing us with this support cannot substitute for all the ammunitions and all the equipment that America has. And so their production is much slower and some of the specific weaponry is not produced elsewhere. So therefore that was close to the reality.
You mentioned a moment ago that this is something that's absolutely vital now, but we don't know what lies further down the road. What do you believe will happen if and when Kyiv asks for help again?
Well, I do think that we should be trying to work on that, on further support already now. We have to understand that we have a strong and capable enemy, and I think that that's not only about military support, but further strengthening of the sanction regime and against Russian Federation and making sure that the sanctions are not circumvented in different ways as they are at this particular moment, and having common goal, that Russia has to be defeated. Are we there yet? I'm not sure that we all are on the same wavelength.
Just bring us up to date with the latest situation in the fight against Russia. The reports this weekend is that Russian forces have taken control of the settlement of Bodanivka in the Donetsk. There is very much a strong narrative coming from Russia that it is making progress in Ukraine. What's actually happening?
Well, we have seen a serious push from the Russian forces all across the Eastern Front and also very severe bombardments of the northern territories near the border, as well as bombardments and attacks across the country. So Russia has been trying also to push while we were starving on munitions and while we were lacking the needed military equipment. So I hope that American aid, once it comes in, will change the situation. And also we are hoping that the F-16s that should be coming also pretty soon will help us to defend Ukrainian territories against the very much used and in big quantities right now, the aerial guided bombs that Russia has been massively using lately, and against the ballistic missiles, against the drones, Iranian-made drones as well.
Finally, we have the EU foreign and defence ministers meeting in Luxembourg today, trying to drum up additional military support for Ukraine. What do you think that this weekend's vote in the United States will do to make sure that the European Union steps up even further?
Well, we see how difficult it is to ensure that the European Peace Fund gets, additional and couple of years ahead funding in order not to have all the time the situation when we are blocked by this or other country to receive additional aid. And we see how difficult also the idea of Secretary General of NATO Stoltenberg on having 5 years, so $100 billion package for Ukraine is also yet not materializing as such. So I do not know whether we should be waiting for some breakthrough in Luxembourg, but definitely I assume that American decision will give additional belief and strength also to the European partners that America is on board and the Western Union is holding together. I think it's also very important for their understanding of their future.
Finally, Ivanna, briefly, if you don't mind, what part can you directly play in this, pushing very much for Ukraine's integration into the European Union? How do you make your voice heard?
Well, we are doing our homework because it is about a lot of work inside the country and changes and transformation of the country, and that then working with the European institutions, but also with the European Union member states. But the EU integration is not the only goal for us. NATO integration is also something critically important for everybody. So I hope that Britain can be on board there as well.
Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, Ukrainian MP and chair of the Parliamentary Committee into Integration of Ukraine into the EU. Thank you so much for joining us on the line. Still to come on today's programme.
This painting comes from a real mosaic that I've seen in Chisinau, the capital of Moldavia, with the ploughman of the universe.
We'll head to the Venice Biennale, where we'll hear from the artist representing Romania, Serban Savu. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio, Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor. Very warm welcome back, Nina.
Thanks so much.
How's the Dos Santos world?
All good, yeah.
Good.
Happy Monday morning,
pushing
bright
on.
And early, and freezing cold. Because, hey, we're in London.
It's ridiculous. Right, let's move straight onto the papers. What have you spotted?
Well, somewhere where it is warmer in Australia, temperatures are fraying. Again, surrounding whether or not social media should be accountable to national laws. There's been a real furore surrounding very distressing images of stabbing in a church, in a Syrian church last week, which the Australian authorities have said social media companies like, for instance, Meta and also X, formerly known as Twitter, should immediately take down. And Meta complied with that. You'll remember that obviously over the last few years, Australia actually has sort of led the way in terms of trying to regulate the social media space. But X instead has said that it wants to mount a legal challenge to this, saying that what they they want to do is uphold free speech, and they're going to challenge it through the courts. That's prompted a number of Australian members of the government, in particular one minister, to say, look, if you want to do business in our country, you have to abide by our laws. This is extremely distressing, violent content, and we want to see it offline. This minister is saying, is not elected by the people, but governments are, and it's for that reason that governments have to, uphold and push big tech companies to try and uphold the laws. Let's see where it goes, but obviously it is yet again another example of Elon Musk deciding that, to a certain extent, he's a law unto himself.
What game is he playing here? Because I think discussions have been had more and more about the influence of the likes of Elon Musk. You just need to think about the satellite systems that he was offering to Ukraine. That you get this idea of power being held in the hands of people who are not democratically elected now.
Absolutely. He's sort of a freewheeling foreign policy, non-state agent. And I've written about this actually for Monocle magazine a couple of months ago. Obviously, this is slightly different because what we're talking about here is a country like Australia and its own domestic laws. But as you were pointing out before, Elon Musk has also decided to use his Starlink satellite system as well to have sway over foreign policy as well. And there's real concerns about how powerful some of these big tech companies, and as you were saying before, the people at the helm of these tech companies and their sort of whimsical behaviour and difficult to predict behaviour, is having on citizens right around the world. Because the reality is that, nowadays politicians have to deal with various types of, electorates. One of them is the ones who vote them in the polls, but the other one is also people who, comment on them on social media, steer the debate and watch what they say on social media. And Elon Musk, is being told here by members of the Australian government, look, the cyberspace isn't its own sort of non-democratic bubble. You have to abide by our rules. And it'll be interesting to see where it goes, because obviously there's other countries that feel the same.
I also wonder what kind of precedent this might set in terms of the coverage of distressing events. I mean, we saw this last weekend when a man set himself on fire in front of the courthouse in which Donald Trump's trial is set to take place. And it was broadcast live on the likes of CNN. Other organisations decided to pull the camera away, but it happened so quickly and it happened live. And there is that sort of age-old edict that's stitched into every broadcaster's soul. Do not show the point of death.
Exactly. I'm glad you pointed that out, because it's sacrosanct in our particular part of the journalism sector, particularly if you're dealing with imagery, because the problem is psychologically, once you've seen something, and there's lots that you and I will have seen that never made air because it's too distressing. Once you've seen something, you can't unsee it. And this is the real concern that obviously governments right around the world have. I have to say that it's not just Australia, New Zealand as well. You remember when there was that terrible attack, when so many people were killed by a far-right sympathiser under Jacinda Ardern's time. You remember she took to task with then called Facebook, now Meta, to try and get that footage offline. The social media companies really, have to be careful, because what they have is they have an opportunity for people to see these things in real time in a way that, licensed and regulated broadcasters like ours have to make sure that they, have a delay on some of this on their live feeds. They have to make sure that they uphold to certain editorial criteria, which also, as you were saying before, doesn't show the moment of death. And in this case, we're talking about showing it, having access to it repeatedly.
Let's move on to a story from the Times today, which is that moment when the innocent holidaymaker suddenly finds themselves in a terrible moment of geopolitical conflict. When you get on a Wizz Air plane, the last thing you want to happen is for the Russians to jam the technology on it.
No, absolutely. And apparently this appears to have happened to 1,368 Wizz Air planes that have logged sat-nav disruptions when flying, particularly near the Baltic. I have to say, I go to the Baltic back and forth. And for work, I've even had the pleasure of taking Wizz Air flights from, I think it was Luton to Vilnius. Excellent, fine, does the trick. But who'd have thought that when you pass near Kaliningrad, and I myself have gone and filmed right up to the border with Kaliningrad, that suddenly the sat-nav has been jammed. This is according to a report report that, by the way, also says that 2,309 Ryanair flights logged sat-nav disruptions, 82 BA flights, and also 4 EasyJet and 7 Jet2 flights. So it appears to be an issue with flights heading towards the Baltics. And this is really concerning here because obviously, everybody's very concerned, in particular in the Baltics, that if the Ukraine war carries along the trajectory it is, that the Baltics could be next, that NATO land could be challenged in this particular part of the world. And I should point out, it's not just holidaymakers. The Royal Air Force has been affected. A few months ago, you might remember that Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, was heading back from Ukraine via Poland, and his flight was affected by this type of jamming technology.
It's an interesting idea that, yes, one would expect military and political flights to be the target. But what realistically can anybody do if Russia decides to jam the GPS of a commercial jet?
I think you can, obviously there's areas you can avoid. And tragically, my mind goes back to the Malaysian Airlines flight that was struck down, costing the lives of hundreds of people travelling from the Netherlands to Malaysia and passing over a war zone that was eastern Ukraine. So obviously, the airline industry will be extremely sensitive to this. What does this mean practically for pilots? Well, according to this report, it means that they have to sort of swerve to avoid phantom objects because the sat-nav starts, sending wrong signals. I suppose they could avoid Kaliningrad. But the reality is lots of these low-cost airlines go to various of those Baltic countries, and they go very, very frequently, and these are countries that are very close to each other. So, how much they can do to avoid Kaliningrad in its airspace is going to be, I'm no aviation expert, but might be quite tricky in that part of the world.
It will be, and it will be costly as well. Finally, an article in the Times that you wanted to draw our attention to. Here in the United Kingdom, they have pretty strict rules about partying after hours. In Milan, they want to stop us from eating ice cream, which is obviously the thing that sets us all off.
Look, full disclosure, I lived in Milan for a number of years and I really enjoyed it.
This is a late night trip to the gelateria.
I don't remember ever eating, pistachio ice cream post-midnight. But hey, I don't know, it was my youth, maybe I did. But the reality is that, and I also lived in two of the busiest parts of Milan that are mentioned in this particular report. I got very, very busy, I have to say, during Fashion Week. There's essentially the authorities, the local mayor says that, it's just becoming too noisy and local residents are complaining that, the city's becoming unlivable in the summer months, particularly around the Naviglio area, that's the canal area, where there's lots and lots of bars that are open later and later and people, staying on the streets to eat a takeaway pizza, perhaps with their feet over the edge of the canal or have a gelato post-midnight. There's about 12,500 eateries, bars and restaurants in Milan, and they're obviously vehemently opposed to this, as you can imagine, because during the summer months, it's really quite warm there. You can't sleep at night. People do take to the streets and do a bit of a passeggiata. And the concern here is that this could just put a dampener on the whole thing. Milan, it has to be said, has tried this manoeuvre before. I remember about 11 years ago, they tried to implement this type of regulation and then had to repeal it. Who knows whether it'll go through this time, but yeah, it's a bit of a shame because I quite like La Notte Bianca,
Who doesn't? And just very briefly, we've got this issue that here in the United Kingdom, in Westminster, which is the city council which looks after the absolute heart of the likes of Soho in the middle of town. They shut up shop for lots of things at 11 o'clock in the evening. And we're now seeing a much more serious thing happening, was that nightclubs and bars are now shutting hand over fist because they cannot afford to keep open. I mean, if you look at Milan, barring ice cream after midnight or barring takeaways, is there a sense that Notte Bianchi that you talked about will be actually sort of everyone will be tucked up by 11 with their fans and one sheet and hoping, wishing they could go out?
The air conditioning more like, because everybody has one of those in Milan. Look, that's the exact point, isn't it? It's that, continental life continental nightlife tends to pace itself in a way that the British one, Tony Blair's efforts notwithstanding decades ago, just hasn't managed to do. I think that might have a lot to do with the climate. It might just have a lot to do with the kind of sense of joie de vivre. But you're right, it's a big blow to the hospitality industry when you get these sort of rather swift regulations that come in and out of force. And, you know, what's wrong with having ice cream post-midnight? Better to do it on the street with friends rather than sitting in front of the TV, right? Binge watching some box set until 4 a.m.
Don't binge on the ice cream, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Nina dos Santos. You're listening to Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A quick look now at today's other news headlines. At least 5 rockets have been launched from Iraq's town of Zumar towards a US military base in northeastern Syria. The attack against US forces is the first since early February, when Iranian-backed groups in Iraq stopped their attacks against US troops. The Maldives ruling party is set to win a landslide victory in the country's parliamentary election, pushing the Indian Ocean island nation further towards China. President Mohamed Muizzu's PNC party has won 66 of the first seats declared, enough for a supermajority in the 93-member parliament. President Muizzu has recently awarded high-profile infrastructure contracts to Chinese state-owned companies. And China's ambassador to Canada has left his post and returned to China. Further details into why Kong Pei Wu, who has served since 2019, has left, were not immediately available. The Chinese embassy in Ottawa has not commented. And thousands of supporters of the former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro have held a rally in Rio de Janeiro. They're reportedly trying to raise his political capital after losing a bid for re-election and facing allegations of involvement in a coup. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 7:35 here in London now. Shares in Chinese airlines are continuing to take a beating after US carriers banded together to urge the Biden administration to block any increase in direct flights between the two countries, accusing Beijing of anti-competitive behaviour. Well, the issue is expected to be on the agenda when Secretary of State Antony Blinken visits Shanghai and Beijing for talks with Chinese officials later this week. A State Department spokesman said Mr. Blinken will urge China to engage in the responsible management of competition between the two countries. From Washington, Simon Mark sent us this report.
Every day, more than 2.5 million people take to the skies. Robust competition among airlines has made flying more affordable and accessible.
That advertisement by Airlines for America, an umbrella group representing the interests of US carriers and their employees, is part of an ongoing campaign to secure a level playing field in the arena of international aviation. But earlier this month, Airlines for America, backed by its members, issued a plea to the White House.
U.S. airlines are asking the Biden administration to halt its approval of additional flights to and from China. Industry lobby group Airlines for America, which represents American Airlines, Delta, and United, wrote a letter to both Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg asking for the pause.
That letter, reported there by the financial news service The Street, accuses China of, quote, harmful and anti-competitive policies over direct flights between the two countries. It claims that the jobs of up to 315,000 US airline employees are now threatened by what it describes as the unchecked growth of China's commercial aviation market. And it says that Chinese airlines enjoy benefits because of their ties to the country's government that America's entirely private carriers cannot match. For instance, on direct routes between the US and China, Chinese airlines are now able to fly through Russian airspace due to the growing friendship between Beijing and Moscow, whereas American carriers must fly a much more circuitous and therefore expensive route because of the Russian war on Ukraine.
As you know, I just concluded several hours of meetings with President Xi, and I believe that they were some of the most constructive and productive discussions we've had.
When President Biden met President Xi Jinping in Woodside, California, on the fringes of last November's APEC Leaders Summit, it seemed that there had been something of a breakthrough in terms of reducing tensions in the bilateral relationship.
The United States will continue to compete vigorously with the PRC, but will manage that competition responsibly so it doesn't veer into conflict, and where it's possible, where our interests coincide, We're going to work together.
That included the area of commercial aviation. The two sides said they would do more to reinvigorate direct flights between the US and China that had come to a complete standstill during the COVID-19 pandemic and over the last 18 months were only just getting back into the swing of things.
We haven't seen this in a while. The Air China desk here has been effectively dormant for years. Now, a steady stream of passengers checking in again.
Just 2 days after the two presidents met, China's English-language state-run news channel CGTN reported on the resumption of Air China's flights to Beijing from Dulles Airport in Washington.
Feel very happy we have fly.
These scenes are far cry from the closed borders and shuttered airport counters of the COVID-19 era, and relief for those who haven't seen family members back home for what seems like ages.
But the promise that seemed relatively bright a few months ago has gone off the rails. Direct flights between the two countries are currently capped at 50 per week, split evenly between Chinese and US airlines. But US carriers say that number should not now increase unless the American government can squeeze concessions from the Chinese and equalise the playing field for a passenger market that is still at only 25% of its pre-pandemic levels. Professor Zhang Lei is with the Institute for Aviation Research at the Swinburne University of Technology in Australia.
Before COVID, Chinese airlines have opened many international routes, particularly intercontinental routes. They flew to everywhere in Europe and also penetrated to a number of secondary cities in North America. The domestic market in China is recovering well. But the international market recovery has been pretty slow.
And he says that initial growth in the international market was essentially underwritten by the Chinese government, contributing to what US carriers now insist is an unfair advantage. The Chinese reject the American aviation industry's claims. A foreign ministry spokesman last week said Presidents Biden and Xi had themselves agreed to increase the number of direct flights between the two countries, calling the proposed moves conducive to enhancing people-to-people exchange and mutual understanding between the two countries. But Secretary Blinken heads to China this week with the US airline industry pushing him to push the Chinese. Just one element on a broad agenda between the two countries. For Monocle Radio, I'm Simon Marks in Washington.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Now, the scale of the general election in India is almost unfathomable. This weekend saw the starting gun fired on the biggest poll in the world. Over 6 weeks, 2,500 parties are vying for the approval of nearly 1 billion people. The event is seen as somewhat of a moment of national pride, regardless of who the people are voting for, because of the very fact that they can vote is something India celebrates, with voting machines being carried by boat, horse and even elephant. Well, I'm joined now by Shruti Kapila, who's Professor of History and Politics at the University of Cambridge. A very good morning to you, Shruti.
Good morning.
So stage one is completed.
Yes, indeed it is. I mean, last weekend, close to 100 plus constituencies out of 550 plus went to vote. And it has been an interesting first run because high voter turnouts indicate, as it were, the return of the incumbent. And while India always returns fairly high voter turnouts in excess of 60 and 65%, there has been a significant dip in the first phase of voting, which is made, as it were, pollsters, hang back a little bit and wonder whether the Modi mandate is going to be, after all, as large or as confident as it has been built to be.
It's an interesting point that you make, given the fact that there is a natural assumption that no one can beat Narendra Modi here. But the one thing that you mention here, which is interesting, is the low turnout. And is that a protest vote? Is that apathy or what?
I mean, it is interesting, as I said, to keep it in perspective, it is still in excess of 65%, but it is, as I said, a significant dip from, I wouldn't say it's quite apathy. I mean, there has been, despite, as it were, the hot billing of this election as the largest and a historic, perhaps third term, for Modi, the sense of, as it were, a wave, that's a kind of word that is used in Indian electoral thinking and commentary. There is no sort of, groundswell of popular opinion, or a win, or as it were, a wave in favor of Modi. So it's a fairly quiet quiet election, the high decibels of voter enthusiasm are missing. In part, it is also happening in the most torrid months of the Indian summer, but I don't think it's just that. I think people are keeping their counsel on Modi. And I think partly because what has come out also is that despite high nationalism, pride, and a strong India on the global stage, and Modi's, as it were, massive personality, the biggest ticket issues in India remain unemployment and high inflation. And I think that has had a sobering effect on the general atmosphere, both for electoral parties, but also in the general mood of the country.
And how much are people actually discussing these issues?
I think there's a fair amount of discussion, partly because the Indian opposition, which has united, 26 plus parties have come together to try and stall Modi, the Modi juggernaut, has made a pretty consistent, effort to highlight not so much identity and culture matters, but really the issue of jobs, unemployment, and cost of living, which of course global issues, but India has also emerged not just the fastest and one of the biggest economies in the world, but also now increasingly easily one of the most unequal societies. So I think there has been a momentum in the opposition campaign. Plus, I think the overextending and sort of strong arm tactics of the Modi government to kind of arrest sitting popular chief ministers, on corruption charges, as well as it were, using large number of government agencies to put pressure and even freeze the party accounts of opposition parties. I think those things are beginning to have a kind of pushback effect on the very things that Modi has prized about himself, namely authority and charisma.
So how free and fair are these elections?
I think there has been a fair amount of murmur in the international press. I think it would be more accurate to say that these are rather unevenly poised elections. The Bharatiya Janata Party, Modi's party, is not only the world's largest party in terms of members. It's twice the size of the Communist Party of China, to give an indication. But it is also one of the richest in Asia, with at least $6 billion in its coffers. These are also going to be very, very expensive elections. So I think it has the kind of money and muscle power and since it's a cadre-based party, also foot soldiers that are like no match for, as it were, the more kind of the scattered regional parties, but also India's other national party, which is the Congress party. The Indian media, too, is sort of in competition, really. Mainstream media tends not to be critical at all of Modi, and only competes to, as it were, approve him. So I think it's fair to say that the opposition has fought back tremendously well, given all these really massive structural inequities against it.
Shruti Kapila, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're with The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's talk Balkans now with Monocle's correspondent in the region, Guy Delorney, who joined us on the line from Ljubljana. Good morning, Guy.
Good morning, Emma, and good morning, everybody.
Let's talk about what's happening in Kosovo.
Indeed. We had a bit of a farce on Sunday in Kosovo because we had a recall election for 4 mayors in the majority Serb north of Kosovo, so in 4 municipalities. And the whole idea was that it would be a recall election. The idea was to remove 4 mayors of ethnic Albanian origin who were representing these majority Serb regions. They were doing that because Serbs boycotted the local elections last year. And it was an untenable situation, really. Everybody recognised that. But we had another boycott yesterday in this recall election, which resulted in one municipality, 0 voters going to the ballot boxes. So it was a very, very, very low turnout indeed, 0.5%, which actually is lower than the 3% turnout which got the mayors elected in the first place. So the mayors remain in place. The situation is chaotic. The Kosovo authorities are saying, well, we've done our part. We've done this recall election. The mayors remain in place and democracy has been served. For their part, the Kosovo Serbs are saying, you set this recall election up to fail by demanding more than 50% of the entire electorate should vote for the recall when only 3% had voted for the mayors in the first place. So it's in some ways it's business as usual, Emma, with accusations flying left and right in Kosovo. But once again, an opportunity to reduce tensions and improve relations has been missed.
Why would you find an ethnic Albanian mayor in office in a majority Serb part of Kosovo?
Why indeed? And this is because of this boycott last year, Emma, because so few ethnic Serb voters turned out. The ethnic Serb parties boycotted the mayoral elections last year. Ethnic Serb voters also boycotted it. So the very few voters who turned out were the very small minority of ethnic Albanians who live in these majority Serb areas in North Kosovo. Now, Kosovo's international partners, the EU and the US and the Quint countries as well, they recognised that this was really not an acceptable situation to have these majority Serb communities being represented by ethnic Albanian mayors, and for those ethnic Albanian mayors to start making changes in those communities, which were putting the Serbs' noses very much out of joint. And they recognised this wasn't good. It was increasing tensions. Something needed to be done about it. But as I said, it hasn't been.
Let's move on to Croatia. We had elections in Croatia last week. Do we have any results yet?
We did get the results. I mean, the results were, I think, as everybody perhaps expected they would be. The results were inconclusive in that neither the governing HDZ, which is conservative to right-wing nationalist, nor the opposition SDP, which is centre-left, got enough seats to form a government either on their own or with their usual coalition partners. So everybody was working out who would be the oddballs who would possibly get together to make up a government. And we seem to have something of an answer developing, Emma, because over the weekend, Prime Minister Andrej Plenković confirmed that the HDZ is in talks with the Homeland Movement. The Homeland Movement it was started by a Croatian folk singer, the kind of folk songs that get people very much up and riled and nationalistic. So you can imagine what their policies are like. And they're not, they're to the right of the HDZ. And bearing in mind that some elements of the HDZ are quite right-wing, you can get an idea of where the Homeland Movement are on the political spectrum. And Mr. Plenković, for his part, said, well, it seems like the voters went a little more to the right, so we have to hear that message and put together the future government accordingly. And this is despite the fact that Mr. Plenković was merrily abusing the Homeland Movement in the run-up to the election.
What is pushing Croatia in that direction?
It's people are feeling rather fed up with the duopoly between the HDZ and the SDP. They feel the SDP has been ineffectual, that when they've had their opportunities in government, that they haven't used them. And for the HDZ, the standard accusation which is levelled at them and which has been confirmed in the courts on multiple occasions is of corruption and clientelism. And as the Australians would say, people want a fair go, and they don't get it a lot of the time in Croatia unless they have the right connections. And those connections are usually HDZ. And as a result, you've got tens of thousands of young people leaving Croatia every year. And that maybe reflects why people are turning not just to right-wing parties like the Homeland Movement, but also green left parties like Možemo, which also did very well in last week's elections.
Finally, let's talk about Serbia. There are new conditions being imposed on the country in terms of whether it's going to join the EU club.
That's right. So the EU Foreign Affairs Council is meeting today, and they're going to revise the conditions of Serbia's accession negotiations to incorporate last year's so-called Ohrid agreement with Kosovo. Now, this was meant to be the big agreement. Pardon me if I'm sounding weary about this. I've been down this road a few times. It was meant to be the big agreement, which was meant to finally normalise relations between Serbia and Kosovo. And of course, it hasn't been signed, it hasn't been implemented, and relations have actually got worse since that Ohrid agreement last year. So the European Union, in an attempt to try and get at least Serbia to start implementing the agreement, is going to incorporate it into Chapter 35 of its EU accession negotiations, which covers all things Kosovo. So that's a little bit of pressure being ramped up on Serbia. And the main thing in there, which is new, is Serbia not standing in the way of Kosovo's membership of international organisations, which is a key thing for Kosovo if it wants to really call itself a functioning state.
Guy Deloney, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You were the Globalist. Finally, today we head to Italy. The theme of this year's Venice Biennale is Foreigners Everywhere, which has been mirrored in different ways by the various pavilions. Representing Romania is the artist Serban Savu, whose exhibition What Work Is explores the iconography of work and leisure. Well, Monocle's Robert Bound met Serban in front of his large mosaic works to find out more.
So we see, looking across here, we see perhaps acts of heroism, perhaps, heroic men and women going about their working day, but we also see sort of Renoirish scenes of riversides with sunbathers. We see something a bit like a sort of Haywain over here with a ferry crossing and things like that. So you're looking at art history and at the sort of propagandist history in art, yes. And it looks also a bit like religious history. Yes, Serban, tell us about how all these meld together in your mind, and whether they also gel together in certain of this polyptych that you put up.
Well, actually, of course, these are the works made during almost 20 years, and many ideas came to my painting in those years. But the curator and I, we selected, let's say, themes and paintings and works more related to the work and leisure, but of course they contain also other ideas. The relation between ideology and propaganda, which is quite an important idea in my work. The polyptych, for example, is a canonical form of art.
There is something very much like a very grand church about this, about the way that you've hung this show as well.
Exactly, it's a religious form of art actually, but in this polyptych is completely like. But my idea and my suggestion is that those religion and propaganda and ideology, they somehow work together, or they meet at some point. In a totalitarian state like Romania was before 1989, religious was overtaken by ideology. And the art of the social realism actually used the figures of the heroical figures of workers as they were saints, and it was a replacement actually. Just thinking about Lenin Mausoleum in Russia now, it's the relic. It was made a saint out of a historical figure. Now it's the same mechanism actually.
And so some of your works here that are the painting of the making of a mosaic. This is something that looks like almost like Vitruvian Man, Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, or something like that. Yeah. And this is what you're playing with these ideas.
Yeah. So this painting comes from a real mosaic that I've seen in Chisinau, the capital of Moldavia, with the plowman of the universe, it's called. Now it's falling apart from the former center of youth, Yuri Gagarin, in Chisinau. And I was stunned by that. Actually, it's a beautiful mosaic, and it's almost mystical, with this Vitruvian Man, as you said before, so powerful and mystical in the same way, because he's controlling the universe in a way. And I imagined this mosaic as it was in a church.
And that was Serban Savu, the representative of the Romanian pavilion at this year's Venice Biennale. He was talking to Monocle's Robert Bound. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers, Chris Chermak, Laura Kramer and Monica Lillis. Our researcher was George Ruskin, our studio manager, Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London, and The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you for listening. Have a great week.